Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. There's a fundamental truth we've been dancing around on this show, Ian, and it's that the climate crisis is in many ways an infrastructure problem. We live in the environment that was built and created by fossil fuels, and changing that physical environment requires changing the infrastructure of our civilization, which requires changing policy, which requires movements in public opinion. None of this is news. It's just news that we try not to tackle head on this show because we're not really that into talking about politics.
Yeah, we certainly have focused more on the entrepreneurial side of the equation on the show. And that's probably largely due to the fact that that's where we spend most of our time in the day-to-day. But as you mentioned, we can't ignore the importance of this intersection between the private sector and the public sector. And this was a really interesting conversation to spend time at that intersection, but to talk about the importance of public sentiment at that intersection.
Yeah, and that's why we wanted to have Nicole Rom on the show today. She's someone who's been in policy advocacy and education for over 2 decades. And now she's with this organization called Good Power. And it's working in a lot of areas to actually combat misinformation around decarbonization and the energy transition, and specifically around supporting utility scale projects and policies, which we both know is a big area of leverage, but we don't know that much about those policy battles happening at the local and state level behind the scenes.
Exactly. And we have talked about the economic case for renewables, right? And how it's pretty clearly a win-win at this point for everybody. But regarding the private sector solutions, as well as the policy solutions, many are facing headwinds, right? And hesitancy and mistrust and even blatant misunderstanding around truth. And I think this episode is really something that consumers and listeners will be able to benefit from.
And for a lot of people, us included, the conversation more or less stops there. But today we're going there. And Nicole's going to help walk us through, for example, what actually happens when a utility scale solar project is going through the local approval process and fossil fuel companies fund some kind of resistance campaign. Like, we all know that stuff is happening, but it's almost like we don't want to know how that sausage is being made. Well, Nicole's here to show us exactly what's going on there and what organizations like Good Power are trying to do about it. So grateful to have her on the show and hope you all learned something too.
Yeah, let's dive in.
And Nicole Rom, welcome to The Turning Point.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. So you've spent the majority of your career working in education around issues related to environment. So how would you describe the current state of public sentiment around some of those issues?
Well, I think that current sentiment is not exactly the best right now. As we know, energy costs in the U.S. have risen 30% just in the last 6 years. We're feeling squeezed by higher bills, whether it's our insurance premiums, insurance, much of this fueled by climate disaster. And globally, we're stuck in low wage and insecure work, one emergency away from another crisis. And at the same time, we've seen rampant disinformation, misinformation, and polarization stall progress on a host of environmental solutions that would ultimately lower costs and build and strengthen communities at the local level. And obviously, my career in the environment has really focused over the last 20 plus years, specifically on the climate crisis. And I just really believe that it provides a huge opportunity for us to transition to a decarbonized future that not only gives us better clean energy, but also healthier and more economically viable lives and communities.
Yeah, and so the things you're saying are pretty familiar to me, right? As the three of us, we're all probably pretty plugged into the reality of the crisis. I'm curious what you've seen out there over the last 20 years in terms of how aware the general public is of the state of the crisis?
That's a great question. And Yale Project on Climate Change Communication has been doing a survey of Americans' attitudes specifically around, they use the term global warming since they've consistently used it since they first did this study. And on the whole, folks who have been concerned continue to show deepening concern for the issue, and those that are dismissive of the issue continue to stay in that camp. And so most of the environmental and climate community is focused on the alarmed and concerned, and has realized that it's less impactful to engage those that are outright dismissing or not really able to change. And I would say on the whole, when I look over my career trajectory from even when I started, early on in my career, I worked for the National Wildlife Federation, managing the education programs for the Midwest before moving to Minnesota to be the executive director of what became Climate Generation. There was really a lack of education and awareness of climate. We weren't feeling the impacts in our backyard in the early 2000s. We were definitely seeing the impacts in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, but not necessarily in our backyards in Minnesota or in Florida. And as the climate crisis has increased in its intensity and frequency, now really you can't talk to anyone who really can't acknowledge weather pattern shifting, extreme events, changes that are a result. And so I would say over the last 20 years, education and awareness overall has grown. Whether or not the awareness of who's, to blame, and the rampant misinformation, disinformation campaign, specifically from the fossil fuel industry, much like we saw around the tobacco industry with smoking, has, it has continued to be really prevalent and a main, I would say, a bit like a thwart to moving progress forward, especially on the clean energy transition. But overall, I would say education has grown just because the intensity of the events and the reality is sort of hitting us in the face, no matter where you live and who you are.
Yeah, I like the way you talk about the backyard impact that's become visible to people over the last, I don't know, what would you say, 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a gardener, you're seeing, your zones for planting shift. If you're a farmer, you're feeling the same impacts. If you're an urban city dweller, you might be feeling urban heat, smoke, and pollution from forest fires. I know in Minnesota last summer, I was struck by the amount of air quality alerts just from the Canadian wildfire smoke. So also acknowledging we're all interconnected, and even if you're hundreds or thousands of miles away from an event, you might still be feeling the impacts of that.
Yeah. So you mentioned some national survey data. I'm curious, does that backyard impact show up in the national survey data? Has that moved the needle in that direction at all?
So global warming is the 13th most important voting issue among liberal Democrats, and environmental protection is 9th. Among moderate and conservative Democrats, global warming ranks 17th, with environmental protection 12th. By contrast, global warming is near at the bottom of congressional voting issues among Republicans. Participants are asked about their most important voting issue, and global warming is only in the top 10 for liberals. So this basically means that climate change, global warming is generally not a definitive driver of vote choice, but it is a consideration for a third of registered voters. Does that help get into it a little bit more? So Yale Project on Climate Change Communication releases these studies, and they look at voters, and they've been doing this for 20 years. And so they've been able to monitor trends and dig down, even down to the geographic level of how concerns have shifted. But another Yale study found that most voters, 65%, think climate change is impacting cost of living. So 88% of liberal Democrats, 77% of moderate and conservative Democrats, 58% of moderate conservative Republicans, and 42% of conservative Republicans all see that it's impacting their cost of living.
That's interesting. I would suspect, again, I'd be curious what the numbers say, and that's probably not in what you're looking at, but I wonder if that connection between climate change and day-to-day cost of living, I wonder if that is something that has evolved over the last 20 years.
I mean, I would assume it has, but based on this, it seems like it. And then as they dig in, 53% of Black voters say climate change is very important for their votes this year. And 41% of those with an income under 50K also express that concern.
That's wild to think about. And I think for me, it really reinforces this. It's probably not the right word, but like the echo chamber of we all live in our own reality. For me, I can't imagine why it wouldn't be like top 2 or 3 for everybody, considering that the climate crisis impacts everybody. Obviously, some of us more than others. But that's really fascinating to hear like where it ranks on people's priorities.
Yeah. I mean, basically, if you're not a liberal, it doesn't fall. And even for those that are self-described as Democrats, it's still, environment is in the top 10, but climate falls even further down the priority list. And that's true. I mean, when you think about what is the most important issue and why we start, and I'll pivot here to good power, but microeconomics, people make decisions based on what's right in front of them and their cost of living right in front of them. And that has stood the test of time. And at Good Power, where I am now, our mission is to empower humanity to accelerate this transition to a decarbonized economy. And we're really intentional about talking about decarbonization and renewable energy and not leading with climate, but leading with affordability, energy security. Because one, we know that these technologies actually are healthier, better for our lives, our economy, and the environment. And we know that it's a better communication tool to tie these solutions to everyone's kind of emergent issues, which right now are rising energy costs and our utility bills. And, of course, concerns around increased energy needs across the country with the rise of AI and data centers. So there's just a lot of demand for electricity generation, and we want to ensure that this transition really is focused on enabling more solar, wind, and battery and energy storage on the grid. And part of our goal with doing that is, combating the misinformation and disinformation, to your earlier point, Ian, reaching people through the messengers that they trust. And most of Americans get their news sources from social media, from people they trust, people they follow. And so we want to meet them where they are with information that's positive and factual and based on real life stories of the benefits of the renewable energy transition.
Yeah. So that's great. As you note, Nicole, and I think this is a really important point, we've had multiple guests on the show underline this. We have reached a point now where the energy transition and backyard economics are very aligned. Mm-hmm. That might not have been the case 30 years ago, right? It might have been more of an idealistic play. Now it's a very practical play.
Well, and I would also say, renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy. Last year, I believe 19% of our electricity generation came from wind, solar, and storage. So it's only going to be growing. And, as we face this geopolitical instability globally, we're seeing the countries that have invested heavily in clean energy and renewable energy in this transition are better able to weather the geopolitical volatility that we're seeing. And in this year, the U.S. will get 93% of its new electricity from solar, batteries, and wind. And before we were talking about opinions and polling, there was some recent polling, and I saw that Stephen Miller's wife, Katie Miller, and Kellyanne Conway even reposted about the benefits of solar energy. So 75% of Trump voters actually support expanding solar energy in the U.S. to bolster our power supply. So we're seeing this reality of, the rubber hits the road in terms of, cost of living, backyard impacts, and just the economics are on our side to make this transition possible.
Yeah, so the economics of the energy transition definitely makes sense now. And so we still have this difference between economic reality and public sentiment, right? So theoretically, since the economic case is so clean, 100% of people should be in favor of this.
Right.
And that's clearly not the case.
Right.
And so then the next question for me, and I'm trying to draw this through line here to what Good Power does, is what is the impact of this polarized public sentiment? So where does the public sentiment come into play in terms of slowing progress and slowing deployment?
One, there's still a very aggressive machine that is stopping this progress. And we see that in local rural counties in local opposition to siting and permitting for renewable energy. Many times, even that opposition might not be actually real or is misinformed, or it's disinformation that's rampant that's hitting their social media feeds. Let's say you live in a rural town in western Minnesota and there's a project for solar and you're being inundated with misinformation about solar. Good Power's role is to do that surround sound, public education, pro clean energy messaging to really combat that echo chamber of misinformation and disinformation. And I'll acknowledge the renewable energy industry is a very nascent new industry, whereas the petroleum and oil and gas industry has been around for decades and has an entrenched, very well-funded misinformation and disinformation campaign. And so we're leveraging every tool in our toolbox to combat those narratives, to really shift culture, to transform beliefs and ultimately policy and energy policy and consumer behavior. And we do that through our own in-house content creator studio, supporting influencers who are trusted messengers on these topics and represent, a wide swath of the American population and can reach people in ways that traditional media may not.
Okay, this part is fascinating to me, right? The information landscape has changed so much in the last 20 years. Speaking as somebody who came from mass communication, right? I started my career in advertising. And the shift in this environment has been really, really wild to me. So you're somebody who has been in this particular space in public education for quite a long time. Can you talk to us about how much things have changed in the last 15, 20 years? Because a lot of us still may not fully understand how different the task of influencing public opinion is.
Yeah, I'll think back to when I moved to Minnesota as an inaugural executive director at Climate Generation. And we were, I was traveling around rural Minnesota with Will Steger, the founder of the organization, who's a National Geographic Arctic explorer. And we were going to rural churches and drawing 700 to 1,000 people in rural red areas of the state who were coming to hear a talk from a polar explorer, but explicitly about global warming or climate change. And they were drawn in because of Will's adventure stories and going to the Arctic and Antarctic. And it caught the attention of decision makers, conservatives, and everybody on the spectrum. And there was a real, I would say, when I look back, there was a real bipartisan effort to support this transition. Now that's ebbed and flowed, but for the good part from like '06 to really the rise of the Tea Party, we really saw a bipartisan effort, and we saw rural folks, youth, faith leaders, and we've seen the youth movement also have its ebbs and flows from like those early years to Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future and the strikes and around the Green New Deal in, the 2019 time frame. But what I can say looking back is there was a strong bipartisan support at the policymaker level in states and across the country. And with the rise of the Tea Party movement and misinformation, disinformation, and as social media really took hold on being the main medium with which people get their information, that's when the polarization really started to deepen. And our ability to reach people just became more challenging. And it became clear that we needed to reach people and engage audience across the political and ideological spectrum and do it in places where it's needed. I love being at Good Powers because we place a huge emphasis on digital and getting people the information that's needed in this space in a way that I haven't seen a lot of organizations really be a first mover and leader in this space. And when I think about the move of misinformation, disinformation, and the power and influencers of the right, there hasn't been this equivalent. And I'm really thrilled to be in an organization that is able to speak to a variety of messengers with the right message and with the right brand. So you spoke, Justin, about coming from an ad agency. I like to think of Good Power as a strategic communications juggernaut, almost like our in-house ad agency. And so we'll use different white labels and communication labels to reach different audiences, whether that's reaching a rural farmer or an urban mother of three. We have different communication channels and brands to speak to that person with pro-renewable energy messaging and talking about, current events. I'll give a few examples, if I may. So recently, we've been testing new technology and how we can respond to an event that happens before a narrative is locked in. So we know that when an event happens, people's opinions about that have a short span, a window span with which they are ready to take in that information and to develop their, opinion or understanding of that. And Good Power has been developing the technology so that we can, one, get the message out quicker with the right messenger and hit the person before the narrative is locked in. So some Spark events where we've been testing this technology to really win folks' attention and influence them when it matters in that quick window. In the last 2 months, we've activated this rapid response creator program we have, where we've been focusing on reaching 10 million people. So a couple of examples of what we've done. One was we asked why solar was absent from the energy affordability discussions that were happening after the president's State of the Union, or when the president traveled to Davos for the big summit and was providing disinformation about wind energy. Another example was when there was Winter Storm Fern that hit Texas and the Southeast, and there were predictions of blackouts and challenges to our grid infrastructure. We immediately catalyzed our creator network to highlight the strong support for solar, to combat misinformation about the grid and reliability. And we're doing that all right away with our influencers to reach millions of people before the narrative gets locked in. And our ultimate goal is really about shifting culture, beliefs, attitudes, but ultimately also policy on the ground and getting more gigawatts of wind and solar and battery storage on the grid.
Okay, I have so many questions about this, but first, just for those of us who are total neophytes, when you say influencers are pushing out information to 10 million people, what channels is that happening through? Are we talking social media like Instagram, X, TikTok?
All of those. Yep. Every single one of the social media sites, exactly. And they're often video contexts with real people providing fact-based content about these events. And so what we do at Good Power is we'll develop creator briefs with content in advance of events, or when we know they're coming, we push them out. And they tailor them based on their unique audience and their unique message and who they're reaching. And it's, really ability to do that within a rapid response time frame. And that's really what we're seeing is needed in terms of how to get communication out to people, both about this transition and about just events overall.
So 2 follow-up questions. One, how do you monitor the impact of these rapid response campaigns?
So one thing I neglected to mention is Good Power has its own in-house data lab with 4 PhD behavioral science experts on our staff. They both do behavioral studies where we're constantly testing attitudes and opinions on wind, solar, battery storage in geographic locations. So we did a study recently on opinions about battery energy storage in Arizona. We did another study around public utility commissioners, which are very important decision-making bodies across the country that make decisions around renewable energy permitting and siting projects across the country. They hold a ton of that authority, and there's a lot of room for public input and shaping and influencing those commissions and public service and county commissions that make these decisions. So we did a study around what they needed to feel more informed around these renewable energy permitting and siting. And guess what we found is they trust each other. They look for support and answers in the wisdom of other service commissions and county commissioners across the country. So we use our own good data lab and research both to inform the messaging and the content that we're putting out, to better tailor the programming that we're doing and the content creation rapid response based on what our good data research has done. And then we're measuring the reach of those influencers, comments, and how often those get shared. Ultimately, obviously, measuring behavior change and attitudes and shifts is a harder piece, but it is key to what we do. And one of our biggest impact measurements is literally the support that we're building towards enabling this renewable energy transition, and how many, our support in doing that surround sound education and pro clean energy messaging results in projects that are approved, constructed, and built.
I do want to touch on that, but real quick, I have to ask, given the situation with the war in Iran right now, and the obvious salience of oil prices. Are you guys responding to that with messaging about the renewables transition, how that could be a better solution than maybe trying to control the production of oil halfway around the world?
Absolutely. We're definitely focusing on the cost angle because we know that that motivates people. And of course, the energy security and, renewable energy, we've seen has become partisan when it shouldn't be. So we're showing up first with, combating those falsehoods and making the connection that where we see investments in renewable energy, we see more security and stable, if you will.
So, Nicole, I want to double click on this because, and this is a question for you in your role at Good Power, but also like over the arc of your career. You've been in so many different spaces doing climate education in one way, shape, or form, right? Young, old, online, in person, left, right, ends of the political spectrum. I've heard you call out two things that are really important just in terms of influencing the narrative. One is time, how quickly you can get in with a narrative to influence individuals as they shape their opinion. And then the other one that I've heard you call out is the microeconomics, right? How does it actually impact people's pocketbooks? What's the cost implications? When you think about the course of your career, are there other commonalities that you find yourself like playing the same chord or tune over and over again to try and actually connect with people in a way that resonates?
I think the third piece of those two, cost and timing, is the messenger, and meeting people where they're at. People trust friends and family. When I look back over my career and I think about, even as somebody who early on in my life, let's pick biking as example. When I was young, we didn't wear bike helmets. But as I grew older and the peer influence of more people wearing bike helmets, I too wanted to wear a bike helmet. And I felt silly if I didn't wear one. So the pressure of, trusted people in your sphere matters, as well as the messenger that's communicating. And one thing that I've known throughout my career is you have to meet people not only with like what their values are and who they are and where they are, but also if you're not the right messenger, finding somebody better that is. So that's another piece that I would say when I think about what's the through line, is thinking through who's the best person to communicate that message. But often it's friends and family or somebody they trust, especially as it relates to climate and the renewable energy transition. One other piece that I'll say, just as I was thinking about the work that we're doing, and just in your earlier question around how do we measure the impact of our content creation and our influencers, is we do know that the more positive pro-solar, pro-wind messages that people receive, the more likely they are to support it. So the more we can kind of inoculate and build the surround sound of that positive messaging, the more we're able to build and shift those beliefs and culture. Similarly, research has shown that when one person gets solar on their roofs, you're more likely to see more neighbors follow, because it's like, oh, I know somebody who did that. I'm seeing the benefits. I'm talking to them about it. The same goes with EV adoption, is that, the increasing of the seeing it, hearing it, understanding it increases your support of it. And so just an example, messaging that Good Power produced, where we took pro-solar messaging and we had a control group to see if there was a difference in terms of exposure to pro-solar messages. We found an 11% increase in perceptions about solar farms and the benefits to a local economy, and an 8% increase in support for building more solar farms than that of the control group. So we're seeing real impacts of this positive messaging, both in real-time behavior change as well as the messaging people are receiving and the trusted messengers that's delivering it as having an impact.
I was wondering if we could zero in, and if you have a specific example, this would be great, of one of these local projects or a regional project where there was the potential of some resistance, or there was some resistance, and Good Power is doing something on the ground to help fight the disinformation in the lead up to some sort of renewable energy project.
Great. Well, Good Power, we're deeply engaged, supporting more than, I think, 180 renewable energy permitting and siting projects across 34 states. We're also doing some of the strategic comms work in a few countries globally, in the UK, Brazil, and South Africa specifically. And part of our goal is securing approval. We've supported approval for 40 renewable energy projects in the last 6 months alone across the U.S. So 2 examples I'll share.
Before you do, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think it would be helpful for people to understand what approval consists of. Like, why is this such a hurdle to renewable energy deployment?
Well, it differs by state and regions, and we're seeing a lot of even pushback for permitting and siting, even at the local state legislative level. But most of the siting permitting decisions happen through a public commission, whether it's a service commission or a county commission, and they are heavily influenced by communications they've received, hearings, and the amount of messages they get at an event where they're making a decision. Seen projects stall because the opposition did a better job of turning out people to a hearing, or has done a better job of influencing a specific subset of commissioners with anti-renewable messaging. So when we say approval, that means a public service or utility commission has approved for a renewable energy project to be permitted. And then once they get that approval, then they can begin the process of building it. So they're often long processes that are not made necessarily by a governor or the state legislature, although policies at those levels can both hinder or support growth, but ultimately it comes down to these local commissions and local ordinances where you live. So, for example, one of the projects that we supported was a 45 megawatt battery energy storage project in Michigan, and it was approved following a kind of a ground softening campaign where we did public education and messaging on social media, where we're both targeting our lists of people that live in that specific county, as well as understanding the voter file and the demographics of the community to make sure that we're reaching people that live there and may have an interest in either submitting comments to the Public Utility Commission or ideally showing up for a hearing. And in this case, we did both social media, surround sound communication that's just positive battery energy storage messaging, not specific about this project or the development, but just about the benefits. We did phone banks of our supporters, activating them ahead of a hearing. And in this case, with this project in Michigan, the siting for this battery energy storage plant happened to be a demolished former coal plant. So it was a win-win for those decision makers to approve this project because it was already a previously used energy site that could be retooled for this new battery energy storage. So that was a win-win. Another example of a solar energy facility, 325 megawatts in Minnesota. We used one of our white labels, so not Good Power, but one of our 8 sub-labels. We were able to generate only positive public comments. There were no negative comments, and we drove RSVPs to a hearing, and it led to the Minnesota Public Utility Commission approving that project in Minnesota. So our work looks like anything from working in collaboration with nonprofit partners on the ground that have field staff to doing that surround sound pro messaging, whether it's battery storage, wind or solar, and where possible, turning out people to those hearings or having them call the commission in advance of a hearing, echoing their support of the project. And as I mentioned, we've, completed or, supported 40 just in the last 6 months. So doing as much as we can to scale renewable energy across the country. And obviously we need to be doing it a lot quicker and faster, which is why the work that we're doing around, reaching people after events and giving them this surround sound messaging is both a short-term and long-term strategy to be successful.
Yeah, thanks for getting into the nitty-gritty with the local and regional projects. I think that's an angle that a lot of people may not have a sightline to.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, that's where the deployment of energy is happening in America.
Right. And, our CEO often speaks of Good Power as having these, I mentioned these 8 white labels and different brands. It's almost like the car company GM. There's a Cadillac for a different type of person. There's the, Chevy truck. And so Good Power operates in the same way where we have several different brands that better speak to the audience we're trying to reach. And so when we're doing these campaigns, we're deploying different, vehicle lines, if you will, to meet the audience where they are.
And so you also mentioned policy being sort of one of the other layers or levels to this larger project. So you've mentioned, I believe, something about being active in midterm campaigns. So what's the process for choosing which midterm campaigns you're going to target, and what does that communication strategy look like?
Yeah, well, and I'll back up and just say, so as you're understanding Good Power, we are both a C3, a C4, and we have a super PAC. So we're able to engage in elections using different levers based on what's needed for different races. You know, we talked a lot about our communications work, which is where we're focused on shifting culture, beliefs. A second kind of bucket of work is around mobilizing mass civic participation and expanding the electorate. So that is our C3 voter registration efforts, which we're well known for, especially among the under 35 demographic, which is a big target of our work this year. And then the third bucket, which we've also spoke heavily, is unlocking the economic power of this renewable energy transition. And so when it comes to our policy work, we're using the C3 voter registration lever. We're using the C4 level if there are specific places or races or political campaigns that we see an opportunity where we can make a difference, and the policies can have the traction to accelerate this renewable energy transition. I'll give an example this year. Obviously, like many organizations, we're deeply focused in Pennsylvania because it has so many critical races at the local level, county level, state level, and federal level. So we're working in states where we see opportunities to move this transition and influence decision-making at all of those scales.
We've had a lot of guests on this show who are speaking about climate from an entrepreneurial perspective. And so it's very common for them to talk about the impact of their work in terms of data. And I just want to call something out in the event that there might be a subset of listeners who are feeling a little creeped out by the data around social engineering in terms of like action. And I just want to say that being someone who kind of identifies with that, I feel like this balance, the balance that like an organization like Good Power is providing in terms of we're actually moving the needle in measurable ways. This conversation is so essential to the climate crisis. And without it, we're all just kind of out here, you know, blowing in the wind with opinions and beliefs, but not actual movement. And so I just think it's really, I just want to call that out in the event that there are some listeners who are kind of feeling like this is a very scientific approach to impacting social sentiment and why that's important, because it has to be a data-driven process in order to actually have an impact.
I appreciate you calling that out, and I also feel I want to underscore, to build durable public will and have policies stand the test of time, you have to shift culture and beliefs, and I don't think we've effectively done that. As an example, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was our landmark clean energy climate bill, the first of its kind in this country, that, you know, passed in 2024, we thought would be, you know, would not face, you know, pushback or rollbacks should Republicans come back in power, which they did in these rural red areas where the majority of the funding was flowing and the clean energy investments were happening. And guess what? There wasn't enough pressure and durable public will to influence those decision makers to really take the hard stand of saying, no, we want to keep these projects in our backyard. And so, yes, I want to underscore the data-driven role of Good Power, but also the fact that I believe to really, one, you have the economics happening, the market's moving towards renewable energy, which is fabulous. And a lot of the work that I did in, you know, the mid 2005 to 2010, where we were passing these renewable energy standards in states to make this transition and this market begin to get a foothold. That's one engine that's moving. But the other, you know, we're not going to have these policies that are going to stand the test of time if we don't build a durable public support. And for me, that definitely starts and ends with the kinds of conversations you're having with friends and families at home about it. And these costs, it happens with shifting cultures and beliefs, which I think is where Good Power's secret sauce is that we're meeting people where they're at, where the media ecosystem is at, and we're using the tools at our disposal to really shift those cultures, beliefs, and attitudes so that the policies are more durable and the decision makers are supporting this renewable energy transition.
Yeah, and I think this conversation in general is just highlighting the intersection between public and private sectors. And, again, we've had people from the private sector on. This is a different narrative, and I'm excited that we're bringing the conversation to the podcast as Justin so frequently reminds me, I'm guilty, absolutely, of being a person who thinks, well, maybe if we just over-index on the market, things might move quicker. And Justin's always there to remind me, like, everybody's a part of the public. And so therefore we can't have this conversation without sitting at this intersection. And I think it's just one it's harder to articulate because it's very emotionally charged. Everyone has their opinions and their feelings about what's happening in the world and what should be happening in the world. And so the fact that, there are organizations out there like Good Power who are really just taking a very calculated approach to impact in the public space and then showing up at that intersection between public and private, I think we probably need more organizations like them.
Yeah. And on the public-private partnerships, we're working with renewable energy companies in many places where they're thrilled to have us do this public education, supportive messaging. They may, it may be a very hand in hand, or they may be like, we're just glad you're there. We're working to move our projects forward. But just want to underscore that is a critical lever here.
Yeah. And since we're ranting, I want to underline a few points here. Number one, this is the tricky thing about the climate crisis. The problems are mass scale and the solutions are necessarily institutional and in the realm of large infrastructure, which is dependent on policy and dependent on public opinion as a result.
Correct.
So it just happens to be a problem which requires institutional level movement. And that has always been a big problem in the United States because politics here are unique compared to other places in the world.
That's right.
Another thing I want to underline is that, and coming from the dark art of strategic communication professionally, I think these conversations can sound very calculated. They can sound very strategic, and to the untrained ear, they can sound like manipulation.
Yeah.
And what I want to be clear about is that what Good Power is doing is on the side of fact-based persuasion.
Correct. Yes.
People are being informed of reality and how reality is economically beneficial for them.
Correct.
And I think that's a very important distinction, right? Because again, I'm not trying to paint a picture of good guys versus bad guys. I don't want the climate conversation to be in that space, but we are combating misinformation here. We are combating lies, period. Things which are
intention to misinform. It's like harmful intent.
Yes, harmful intent. Exactly. So again, I don't want to be in the realm of good and evil, left and right, anything like that. But what I'd like to say is economic survival and biospheric survival are not partisan. And I think this is the side that Good Power is on. This is not left versus right.
Absolutely. I get always asked, well, how do you stay hopeful? And I always come back to, well, the solutions are readily available, right? And I remain hopeful because I see the market trends, because I see all of the different organizations in the ecosystem playing their part. And there was a recent interview that the New York Times did on their Sunday podcast called The Interview with Rebecca Solnit, a renowned, writer on many of these topics. And I'm going to quote her because I felt like it encapsulates this moment beautifully and this sentiment. You can be thrilled by all the things that are happening and horrified by all the things that should be happening but aren't. Everything we can save is worth saving. Everything we can do is worth doing. We've already lost a lot, but we don't have to lose everything. We don't have to surrender.
Well said by Miss Solnit. And I'm curious about you, Nicole. You've been in this game for quite a while. Where are you on the optimism-pessimism spectrum?
Well, I've always been glass half full and on the 10. I mean, I'll just say when I look back over my arc, I've always been interested in the environment and the outdoors, and I had formative experiences and role models. Starting with my family and, in high school and college, all of those moments that sort of begin to imprint you and set you on a life path. And when I was in college, I was trying to decide, do I want to pursue an environmental path or an education path? And I ended up doing the Peace Corps right after college for 2 years in the Republic of Kazakhstan, which for listeners who don't know where that is, it's in Central Asia, former Soviet Republic, ninth largest country in the world. And I thought, what an interesting place to be an environmental educator where they did nuclear testing, and one of the world's worst environmental disasters took place, the drying up of the Aral Sea due to irrigation, much like we're seeing with the Great Salt Lake here in the US and Utah. And it was through that experience, 2 years teaching, that I realized my passion is really environment, and education is a strategy for me to reach the environmental outcomes I seek. And that clarity kind of set me on the path of, grad school and pursuing an environmental career path where I was, in the education path at the National Wildlife Federation, and saw how it was so siloed from the policy strategy. And I really saw the need to blend, much like we've been having in this conversation around behavior change and education and policy and institutional change. There are many great organizations, but many of their programs can be unfortunately siloed, and the strategies, I think, there can be much more beneficial when you're working cohesively. And so when I had the opportunity to build and run Climate Generation and to pull the levers of education policy and not have them siloed, I was really interested in that. And, communication, education, and policy has been a through line. And so I feel really lucky to have landed at Good Power at a time where it feels like these are some of the pieces of the puzzle that feel necessary in this moment to ultimately get this equitable clean energy transition that we are striving towards.
Yeah. And Nicole, it's great to hear your story and your evolution, because we have a lot of guests and listeners for this show who are doing their best to take that heart-led mission and that love for the natural world and somehow translate that into high-functioning organizational impact. So what thoughts do you have for those people? What does it take to turn that passion into high-functioning impact?
Thanks for that question. I think always being clear on what your center of gravity and what brings you to the work. You may not always be lucky enough to have what you're super passionate about and what your work is joyfully meet. For me, it has been the case. But, I would say whatever it is, make sure that you're able to hold both, whether or not they come together. And as far as high functioning organizations, over my career, I've learned a lot around, I've been in organizations that have been high functioning and orgs that have work to do. And some themes that I've seen are, there's power in charismatic leaders. I had Will Steger as this founder when I was running Climate Generation. But ultimately, having passionate, dedicated staff, having a very clear, tight mission that meets the world, that meets what's needed, and you're uniquely suited to deliver on that, I think always needs to be held. Holding, the economic volatility, like we're finding ourselves in the nonprofit sector, has really been constricting. And unfortunately, we've been seeing organizations dissolve with the loss of federal funding, or donors, pivoting, or philanthropy not able to meet the immense need of all of the issues that needs support. Is staying true. So I mentioned staying true to your mission and knowing what you're uniquely qualified to contribute in that space, making sure you're stewarding your financial health and the donors and the folks that are supporting your mission, whether it's clients you're serving and how you're generating revenue, but always keeping a close eye on those three: your mission and who you're serving, your financial stability, and the piece that's bringing in the revenue have been cornerstone, I think, to when I've seen organizations thrive and succeed, is when you're paying attention to all of those.
And I know that you are relatively new to Good Power as an organization, but how is Good Power approaching both the urgency of this moment and also that challenge of running a healthy organization and thinking long term?
The organization has scaled tremendously. We recently rebranded last fall to Good Power, and it was sort of a natural trajectory of the messaging and the work and the storytelling that the organization had always had in its DNA. It was an organization I had partnered with heavily when I was running Climate Generation, because it was in the climate education and youth organizing space. What I've noticed about Good Power is and same with my time running Climate Gen, is you need to be nimble and adapt to the moment. and flexible and creative with how you're meeting the moment with new programs, new ideas, new opportunities. And so what I love about Good Power is always, it had data as core to its work, innovation is into its DNA, and like constantly innovating. And it's growing, which it's great to be in an organization that's growing and in a growth mindset to meet the moment of what the world and the country needs on this transition, and doing that by being really both thoughtful on structures and policies and the people, and not being shy about attracting the best talent from all kinds of sectors. That's one thing that I've been really impressed at Good Power is we have the PhD scientists on the Good Data Lab. We have AI engineers, we have content creators and video producers all in-house in an organization that operates almost, like a private agency in terms of the type of expertise and skills and capabilities. So I think our CEO, Leah Cuspo, holds the vision, and then, hiring the right talent and having an eye towards the pieces I mentioned before, but always being willing to be innovative and nimble and test new things and try new things. And that to me is exciting and critical at a time when so much feels so uncertain. Is we need to constantly be willing to be open and curious and try new things.
Yeah. In my experience, what you're describing is unusual. A nonprofit which operates with an entrepreneurial mindset and speed, and a sort of scientific rigor and tinkerer's mindset.
Yep.
Having those three nodes in one organization sounds pretty unusual. It sounds pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's been a great place to land in the few short months that I've been here, but I'm excited about our upward spiral and our strategic plan and where we're growing and leveraging all the tools that are in our toolbox right now in order to really accelerate this decarbonized economy that we desperately need.
So we like to end the show, Nicole, with a couple of what we call the big asks, an opportunity for you to speak directly to the listeners. And the first question is, what is the highest leverage system level change that would accelerate the energy transition?
Well, given we've been talking a lot about renewable energy, for me, renewable deployment is one of the biggest levers, and we're doing a lot of this work at utility scale. Obviously, residential is all important, but we're working on how do we add megawatts and gigawatts of renewable electricity on the grid. So that would be my answer for the highest system lever.
And then we like to ask, what is something that individuals who are listening can do in their own communities to move the needle?
A couple of things. One, start with conversations with friends and family around your concerns around this issue, and how you're taking action in your own life. I love, organizations like Rewiring America. There are several that are really helping households and individuals think about electrifying their life, one appliance at a time, and thinking about that not in, I need to do it all immediately and this is so cost prohibitive, but okay, you're in your home, a 10 to 15 year horizon. As each appliance comes due, choose electric. Other actions I would encourage for those that are entrepreneurs or work in the private sector, there's a lot of power that employees have in influencing their workplace around supporting strong climate action, both within your supply chains, within your policies, within your processes, but also in how your company shows up in policy spaces and advocating for strong climate policy. We didn't get into any of that, but there's been a lot of greenhushing in the private sector, and I just think there's a lot of opportunity for employees to pressure their workplaces on, not just the internal actions, but also externally how they're showing up to support or stop or block this transition. And then my last one is knowing that for those here in the U.S. with the midterms coming up, learn about your candidates on issues that matter to you, including climate and renewable energy deployment and how they're going to bring costs down for you around energy and affordability and what that transition looks like, and making sure that you're making time to vote from everything from local races to the midterms. I myself have local races here in my town today, so I will be going to vote for my board of trustees and mayor. So I just encourage folks to pay attention to the elections where you.
Absolutely. Greenhushing. First time hearing that term. Maybe that's a Maybe we'll have to have you back, Nicole, to talk about that.
I would encourage you to interview Climate Voice. I serve on their board, and their whole mission is to galvanize employees in the private sector to take strong climate policy action. So I'm happy to make that connection. And greenhushing is the silencing of companies on all things climate, DEI. I mean, we're seeing it on a host of issues where they're just choosing to not talk about it, roll back efforts, or just keep doing the work, but do it silently. And the impact that has on, to our earlier conversation about the power of peers, when the whole sector is silent, it really does a disservice.
And coming from a communications expert like Nicole, that's a great tease for a future episode.
Great.
Nicole Rom, thank you for coming on The Turning Point today.
Thank you for your questions, Justin and Ian. It was great to speak with you.
Good to talk with you too, Nicole.
Big thanks to Nicole Rom for being our guest today. You can learn more about Good Power at goodpower.org. And if you're a mission-driven leader looking to grow your organization's impact, you can learn more about us at stillpointinsight.com. Thanks to you for listening and for doing the work that you do.